Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Josh Edelman. I'm a Deputy Director at the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, and I work with the team who have the tremendous opportunity to lead our networks for school improvement work. It's a true pleasure to be here today with all of you. It's also a privilege to be here with three of our intermediary leaders who are working day in and day out with school and system leaders to support Black, Latino, and students experiencing poverty to be ready for post-secondary success, and our formative evaluation partner, who will share promising findings meant to push your thinking. I'll introduce them in more detail in a bit. First, I want to share a little bit more about how our Networks for School Improvement work is going. Since we launched the strategy in 2017, we've seen tremendous interest and progress in this effort. Through our partners, we have learned about the power of local context and working closely with stakeholders closest to the problems impeding student outcome growth, the importance of building trust with district leaders and school level educators, the necessity of using continuous improvement to adapt research-based interventions, and the importance of progress monitoring and using practical measurement and data to drive effective implementation. Two words, though, need to be specifically highlighted: adaptability and trust. With the onset of COVID-19 in March, our intermediaries have adjusted their work to meet leaders and educators where they are and refocus their continuous improvement on learning loss and recovery, student engagement and relationships, and digital learning. I want to applaud all 24 of our Networks for School Improvement partners, running 32 networks across the country, for the impressive ways they have continued to work diligently to support students during the pandemic. During our time together today, you will hear from NSI leaders about their creativity to meet this moment, the challenges they are facing using continuous improvement to support students, and about the opportunities they see to build a better and braver post-COVID world for young people. With equity as our continued North Star, as a K-12 team at the Foundation, we continue to learn with and from our intermediaries and are thinking deeply about how we share, improve, and scale promising strategies to accelerate even greater learning across the field. With these thoughts as context, we are excited to welcome you to our Networks for School Improvement Year 2 update, emerging lessons from NSI partners, and how we can continue to improve together. Before I introduce our panelists, one housekeeping piece. We only have an hour with you today, but we want this conversation to continue. I encourage you to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. While we may not have a chance to answer all your questions today, we as the Foundation will collect questions and share answers through Twitter in the upcoming weeks via our @GatesUS Twitter handle. So if you don't already, please follow us there, and please do submit questions as they come up for you. Additionally, if you have any technical issues, please use the chat function for that. Now, let me take a minute to introduce you to who you'll hear from today. First, we'll have a conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Chu, the Executive Director of the Center for Public Research and Leadership at Columbia University. Liz and her team have been partners in this work since it began in 2018. Today, they're releasing their formative evaluation with some key recommendations that we'll get into shortly. After our conversation with Liz, we'll talk with three of our NSI partners in a panel discussion. First, we'll hear from Tiffany Dinez, a program manager in the Career and College Success Department within Denver Public Schools. In this role, Tiffany manages the Denver Public Schools NSI work, which includes district, regional, and school-based members that focus on meaningful collective action on finding solutions and creating new knowledge that will advance their ability district-wide to address longstanding equity concerns and accelerate academic and whole child outcomes for high school students who are Black, Latino, and/or experiencing poverty. Second, you'll hear from Jackie Levin, who's also here with us today. Jackie is a co-director of the University of Chicago's Network for College Success. At NCS, Jackie directs all local and national program operations. She oversees the design, implementation, and evaluation of the NSI work with their cohort of 18 schools, serving over 15,000 students. With Sarah Duncan, her co-director at NCS, Jackie ensures the sustainability and growth of NCS with a robust strategic plan focused on continuous improvement, an all-in effort to create more equitable outcomes for Chicago's young people. And finally, we have with us today Edgar Montez, Edgar is the project co-director of the Carpe College Access and Success Network within the Center for Research on Equity and Innovation at the High Tech High Graduate School of Education. He works with a passionate group of college access and improvement science professionals to advance the college and career readiness and success of students in schools and districts throughout Southern California. Our goal for our conversation today is to have an engaging dialogue with these thoughtful leaders and provide you with some actionable lessons learned that will help you in your work, whether you're an educator, district leader, stakeholder, funder, or just interested in the work in our field. I also want to be mindful to set the tone that we're in an unprecedentedly challenging time right now, navigating circumstances we could never have predicted that are far worse for the students and families at the center of our K-12 strategy. While the work captured in the CPRL report mostly focuses from outside the pandemic, it is still important for us to share what we learned and what CPRL is recommending. I want to honor the work each and every one of our partners continue to do to support students, educators, and communities. And it's personal for me as a former high school teacher and principal, and even more importantly, as a father of 2 school-age kids. I have deep empathy and immense gratitude for what we're doing. Very excited about our conversation. And with that, Liz, let's jump in. Liz, thank you so much for being here today with us. CPRL has created an in-depth, detailed review of the NSI work. Help us understand a bit more about how you went about your work and walk us through what you learned.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Josh. I am so grateful for the opportunity to share more about what our team has learned over the past 2.5 years. So over the past 2.5 years, we conducted a formative evaluation of 9 foundation-funded networks that were representative of the broader NSI portfolio in order to answer 2 overarching research questions. The first, how are intermediaries and hubs implementing the NSI strategy? And the second, what are the characteristics of effective networks and intermediaries or hubs? When I say hub here, I'm talking about the entity or entities that are responsible for organizing and facilitating the activity of the network. We've seen hubs that are intermediary organizations, hubs that are school districts, or hubs that are a coalition of partner organizations. And in fact, all 3 of those typologies are represented in our sample. Next slide, please. To answer our research questions, we conducted over 150 interviews of hub staff, school team participants, school leaders, and district leaders, and observed over 20 network-wide convenings and analyzed hundreds of documents. In order to measure the quality level and effective network activity, we focused on 3 indicators of success. The first was strengthened adult mindsets and practices. Here we looked hard at the use of data, the use of continuous improvement practices, and the use of systems thinking. The second key indicator was the spread of effective change ideas. So once a team has deemed that a change idea works, how does that change idea spread to other teams in a school, to other teams and schools in the network, and to other teams and schools outside of the network? The third key indicator was student level learning and educational attainment. So how are the practices and change ideas that were being advanced and the network activity as a whole impacting student outcomes? Next slide, please. So what did we find? From a technical standpoint, all networks in the sample are more or less being implemented in ways that are consistent with what the current literature says is necessary to engage practitioner teams in the continuous improvement process. So if you went to any of the networks in our sample and just observed a snapshot in time, you would see that all the networks in the sample are doing things like having a network structure that organizes participants, recruiting participants from multiple levels of the hierarchy in school systems, developing a network-wide theory of improvement and an equity-centered aim, developing the capacity among participants around a problem of practice and around improvement methodology, conducting rapid cycle testing, and monitoring network health and function. And yet there was a lot of variability of performance on the efficacy measures that I already described, with 2 of the 9 networks outperforming all others. So we used that variability to our advantage to help expose the drivers of different outcomes. We were laser focused on the question, how do networks and their hubs effectively organize and manage continuous improvement activity to meet the ambitious, equity-oriented aims set by all networks? And 4 key findings emerged. I'm going to frame all of these around ambition because I think that's the key idea here. Networks are trying to do something different. They're trying to advance equity at a level we don't see in the education system. So these networks did 4 things to get at that level of ambition. First, the ambition of their testing aligned with the ambition of their aim. The NSIs who were furthest along designed systems that rigorously tested proposed solutions and codified their learnings. How did they do this? They did things like they selected change ideas and coordinated testing. The hubs helped school-based teams select change ideas that were likely to work, and they coordinated testing across sites to ensure that there was a manageable number of change ideas in play at any given time, and that those change ideas could work together in ways that would move the network along at the pace required to reach their longer-term aims. They also ensured that participants engaged in full test cycles. The practitioner teams consistently studied before acting. The hub supported network members in completing this full test cycle, something that was a struggle in almost all other networks. In these 2 standouts, team consistently studied collected data. They compared actual results to predictions, and only then did they act accordingly. They also codified what worked. So the hub collected evidence of what works for whom and under what conditions. They documented those findings, and they shared them in ways that were accessible to all practitioners in the network. The second ambition that these 2 took on, unlike the rest, at a level unlike the rest, was the ambition of cross-team, cross-school, and cross-network problem solving and collaboration aligned with the ambition of the aim set. The most effective networks and hubs got people working together in new ways. They broke down barriers between teams and schools. They went far beyond linking teams together at network events. Both of these networks group schools into affinity groups and have routines that these groups use to engage in meaningful cross-school collaboration between network convenings and events. And in fact, many of these affinity groups end up communicating multiple times per month. Even pre-pandemic, these teams weren't always physically proximate to one another, and they connected virtually to do so. The third type of ambition was that they were very ambitious in terms of their engagement in system-level actors, again, at a level that matched the ambition of the aims. Both of the high-impact networks have systems, in this case, mainly school district level actors, playing active roles in analyzing problems and developing solutions that are appropriate for each level of the system, pushing on all levels of the system at once to advance this type of change. And lastly, they were extremely ambitious in their own management approach of the network. So in most networks, hubs were facilitating a process that would train others to organize, manage, and problem solve in new ways. But while they were training others to organize, manage, and problem solve in new ways, the hub was continuing to use management approaches typical of many large education systems. But those 2 standout networks that were furthest along, they not only helped others manage their work in new ways, but they applied those same continuous improvement principles and practices to their own work, and with the rigor that they encouraged in others. They truly positioned themselves as participants in the network, rather than merely orchestrators of the improvement work of the network. They collected data on their own management. They engaged in short cycle tests to improve their management approaches. They refined their interventions and strengthened their management approach, and they connected their learnings to the network strategy. In many ways, it is this continuous improvement management approach that we saw that is what allowed those 2 networks to generate the other 3 drivers I already discussed.
Thank you for that, Liz. And I appreciate the fact that you anchored a lot of the different kind of findings in relation to equity. And you also talked about in relation to context, which I think are very important parts of our work and what we're learning about. A couple follow-up questions for you I'd love to ask. First one, of these key highlights, what surprised you the most? What promising practices did you see?
Yeah, well, I'll start with where I ended, which is that the continuous improvement management approach was so impressive to see in action. Again, one of the most promising features of the NSI strategy is to enable networks, and when those networks are not districts themselves, to model for school districts how to break free of ineffective management approaches, most notably bureaucracy and managerialism that have dominated large education systems to date. So it was so inspiring to see networks and hubs doing just that in the process of generating one of the key practices that I will highlight again, which is about matching the ambition of the testing with the ambition of the aim. This is something that we have seen networks struggle with across the country in the Gates NSI portfolio and outside of it. In getting folks acclimated to improvement science and in orienting them to this new way of working, we see so much time spent on testing ideas that are unlikely to end up producing the type of ambition set by the aim, or moving at a pace that is unlikely to get you to the aim that you set. But these two networks matched their testing ambition with the aim, and they involved system-level district actors in that work, with the result that the system-level actors contributed to the change within the network schools, changed the broader system, and gained powerful new ways of working that they can spread to others. So for folks who are on the call today and are a practitioner, a participant in the network, a network hub member, perhaps on the call, one of the things I would encourage you to ask yourself is, if we continue with our current ambition, rigor, and pace of testing, will we achieve the systemic outcomes that we seek to realize on the timeline that we're hoping to see them happen? And the last plug I'll put in here, Josh, is that the report that we've released is a research report, but we are spending time over the next few months to develop an NSI playbook where we're hoping to translate a lot of these research findings into very, very practical tips, tools, practices for practitioners who are leading and managing this work.
I appreciate that plug, Liz. It's going to be incredibly important that we take the findings and recommendations and create the opportunity for different stakeholders to be able to think about how to apply them in their context. So it's exciting that that work is upcoming. One last question for you before we talk to our NSI leaders. And I want to make sure we're talking about this type of question in the context we're in. As someone who spends the majority of your time learning about and listening to educators and leaders across the field, what makes you optimistic about the progress of this work?
Yeah. Well, first, seeing the work of the whole sample, how far all of the NSIs have come, their commitment to this work that is very hard and important work, their commitment to their students and to their students' futures is just extremely heartening. So I want to start there. But I also, if you go to this, oh, you're on the slide, perfect. I want to mention one thing about this last slide that is first. And this focus on equity speaks directly to an important shift that occurred over the course of our study. And that was a dramatic increase in the extent to which networks explicitly foregrounded racial equity in their work, something that is always important and feels even more so today. So in the first year of our study, this is something we looked at really carefully, and we looked across the networks and arrayed how explicit each network was on their equity focus. Some being much more implicitly focused and some being more explicitly focused on equity. And in fact, the sample was split in half. About half of the networks in that first year did not have an explicit equity focus in their work beyond having an equity focused aim, which is something we see all the time. We've named this equitable aim that we're working toward, but we've left implicit how we plan to get there. What are the equity oriented drivers, secondary or primary, and leaving those implicit rather than making clear exactly what they are. We shared these findings with the NSIs at the conclusion of the first year. We shared them with you, Josh, at the foundation and your peers and colleagues. And around the same time, the diversity, equity, and inclusion focus also became a focus of the foundation's community of practice, where all of the networks learn together. And by the second year, we saw a complete shift. By the end of the second year, all networks had an explicit focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in their work. Every single network offered diversity, equity, inclusion, capacity building supports, and many networks have integrated equity-focused drivers and measures into their theory of network improvement and in their monitoring system. So there's still a ways to go, but we see these as extremely important steps. And we also take heart in the fact that the networking across networks in the community of practice and the foundation's efforts seem to have had good effect.
Thank you so much, Liz. Now that you've got a little insight into what was captured in the first 2 years of this work, I do hope everyone will read the CPRL report. It'll be on the CPRL website today. Their website is cprl.law.columbia.edu. I'll say that again, cprl.law.columbia.edu. I'm sure if you go to CPRL, just type in CPRL, it'll pop up for you. Now I want to transition to the full panel with Jackie, Edgar, and Tiffany. I want to ask kind of a broad question to all of them first. These educators are leading the work that Liz so beautifully described. The report found that NSI hubs that did 4 things, as you just heard, are showing early indicators of success. And I'm going to read them for our audience just one more time. And I'd love to ask each of you, and I'm going to have you go first, Jackie, to explain how you've done this work and how this plays out in your network, or if it doesn't yet, because that actually is a reality for some of our folks, given where you are in the work. So I'm going to read these 4 different promising NSI strategies to improve outcomes. Number 1, using continuous improvement principles and methods to guide an ongoing NSI management improvement process that draws from and feeds into the problem of practice improvement work. Number 2, as far as promising NSI strategies, developing strong network routines and norms to spur cross-team problem solving and collaboration. Number 3, designing systems that allow the NSI to rigorously test, vet, and codify effective change ideas. And number 4, meaningfully integrating system-level actors into the network to accelerate spread and systems change. So Jackie, I'd love for you to go first, then we'll go to Edgar and then Tiffany. Jackie.
Josh, if I can quickly say, I'm so excited and honored to be in this conversation with you, Edgar, and Tiffany. So thank you very much. As you know, Josh, the Network for College Success is almost 15 years old. And since our inception, we have facilitated professional learning communities. We've always done that, and it's always been based in research. And what that looked like for us prior to the NSI is we unpack the research, we wrestle with it, we translate to how it looks in practice, we geek out with it, we're nerds, we're at a learning institution. And while we've had great success with that, that takes a tremendous amount of time, and we are not the doers of the work. And so implementing improvement science has done a number of things for us. In general, it has expedited so many things. We are learning faster. We are learning smarter, if I can make up a term, because we're tracking so many measures along the way that give us indications as to whether things are working or not. Or like Elizabeth talked about earlier, we're facilitating schools to do systems investigations at the local level to make the work meaningful for their context. And it enables us to celebrate early wins. And so when you're talking about changing adult behavior, which is incredibly hard, it's important to be able to celebrate small successes to get folks to continue to transform and then spread the work. In order to do that, though, finding number 2, we have found that we've had to be relentless about routines and norms that set conditions for folks to have real honest conversations about race and equity, that hold folks accountable to themselves, and then push folks to hold other folks accountable in the community. You know, otherwise, why are we in a network if we're not going to hold one another accountable? In terms of codification, Elizabeth is right. The discourse changes when we ask the question, how do we know and who is this working for? That level of discourse changes when you have process measures along the way to look at, and you can have those fierce conversations about race and equity. And so what we're struggling with, though, is how do we deliver the things that we've codified in a way that folks will actually use it, right? We don't want to give a toolkit that's so massive, people get overwhelmed and don't use it. Or we don't want to turn complex, adaptive, transformative work into a step-by-step technical process, because that's not the truth of it, right? And then, Josh, how am I on time? Do you want me to hit number 4 or keep going?
Please,
Okay.
please, you're doing great.
And then in terms of number 4, we really work hard to maintain our relationships with the district, very large district, 3rd largest district in the country. And so there's multiple actors we've been working with. The push that I love that Liz alluded to earlier is we have done a lot of work on communicating and aligning values. What we need to shift to is facilitating change ideas at different altitude levels of the district that support what we're seeing on the ground with the schools. With that, we're excited.
I love that, Jackie. Edgar, before you jump in, just to offer a bit in some of the fine points. I love the fact that you talked about behavior change. You're talking about this work is about mindset, creating a mindset in relation to ongoing improvement, even in the midst of the challenging circumstances we're in right now. Love the focus on mutual accountability. And the fact is, between Secretary Duncan and between the current CEO, Janice Jackson in Chicago, you had several different superintendents And NCS's work stayed just as relevant as ever because you had created demand from your principals and demand from district leaders at that regional superintendent level. So love the fact that you had invested system level actors in the work. Appreciate everything you shared. Edgar, would love to turn it over to you next.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, and like Jackie, I am so honored to be part of this panel with everyone here today, and especially to the Gates Foundation and CPRL for providing this opportunity to reflect on our work. I also have to acknowledge all of our CARPE College Access and Success team members. We are an amazing group that is, you mentioned two words, Josh, adaptability and trust. And I think that speaks directly to some of, just the way that we interact as a hub team and how it has been amplified, especially in these last few months. But I mentioned that because I want to start there talking about the relentless focus that we place on developing ourselves as a hub and really looking at ways that we can do better, that we can provide better tools, as Jackie mentioned, having consumable documents and change packages and things that teams that we know are going to be useful and effective. And if not, then how can we improve on that? One of the things that we do quite often is we have a lot of sessions where we take our own time to reflect. So structurally, we've been intentional about the times, the days that we set up as design days for our hub, looking at high-level design days, looking at planning for events that we have, having weekly team meetings where we can analyze certain data, or coaching calibration sessions where we can talk about how is it going with coaching for these particular teams or these other teams. And so there's a lot of interaction between our hub team members, and in all of these, there are consistent pieces that we often encourage and really ask our school teams to do in all of our districts, is to really take a close look at your data. What data do we have access to? What data do we not have access to? What can we continue to look for? Two examples that really come to mind. One is, we started with a strong focus in our network on FAFSA completion. We had a prior college access network that really focused on some key drivers, and one of them was FAFSA, and we carry that over into the work that we're doing now. And so we started with FAFSA completion and FAFSA focus. And we have this great data studio that we created for our network that we've revised over especially this last year, adding equity aims and equity goals that our teams have set forth, breaking it down for our teams to actually look at, week by week, how many more students do you have to get to? If you said that you're going to get at 80%, how many more students do you need to get to in the next 6 weeks that you have, or the next 2 weeks that you have? But we've also looked at creating data studios for ourselves and these ways. So we have these FAFSA, what we call FAFSA tiles. So we can quickly take a glance at year-over-year improvements for our teams. Where are they in relation to prior FAFSA completion? Where are the teams that we really need to focus in and drill a little bit more to look at our coaching notes, or look at some other data, maybe, just reach out to those particular teams, or ask those questions in our upcoming coaching visits or site visits that we have scheduled. We also, this past year, we implemented something new for our network, which was to develop these online asynchronous modules to really gather more information about the college application milestones for our students. And it was both a tool to help us gather data to improve the college application process, but also quite a large task in just implementing something new. And so for our hub team, we needed to create something to give us a sense of how are our teams doing on the implementation side of rolling something out like this. We know that this is a great improvement tool, but how can we better understand the implementation and sort of who's done what stages are they at, what modules have schools and students completed, so that we can then turn that back around to others that are leading some of that work on the implementation side, that is ultimately going to influence the improvement data that we can have to turn around, and they can have actionable data. So a lot of work around focusing on the type of data, the routines, the processes that we have, that we ask our teams to do. I will also say, we have some key documents that we share, and one of those is our FAFSA change package. And as you mentioned, in these last few months, there's been a lot of having to adapt to this new environment. And one of the activities that we recently did at our last convening is we've had this FAFSA change packet that we have improved, and we've added new things. And as Liz mentioned, you know, our driver diagram includes items, you know, some change ideas that we say all of you should be doing these things. And here are some other things that maybe, you know, you should try out that some should be doing. But we are a bit explicit about these are, you know, this is what everyone should be doing. And these are some other things that it would be great if you did. And we want to gather that data, that feedback to know if it's working. And so this FAFSA change packet that we have created really elevates those ideas, the results of those tangible things that schools can walk away with, they can just take and implement in their own FAFSA work. So again, like Jackie mentioned, just having things that are very easy, but also tied back to the work that they can actually see their work reflected in the last 2 years of doing this improvement work. The last thing I want to end on is, you know, we especially in the last few months, and I remember our program officer at the Gates Foundation, you know, asked us a question about what is it that you know, in this time period, what is it that you really want to double down on? And I think it really speaks to continuing to foster and build the relationships with our schools and our leaders. And that has been from the inception of our network, but it's so critical, especially now. We ask a lot of our site leaders. We call them lightning rods. Our lightning rods do so much for their teams. We have so many meetings with them. You know, in the last couple of years, we created these webinars, these series of webinars for lightning rods to give them to build their capacity as leaders, both in improvement science, but also as leaders, as team leaders, because many of them are counselors or teachers, and some of them are assistant principals, but they're still building their own capacity. So how do we elevate them as leaders within our network so they can feel empowered to do and continue this work at their school sites?
Edgar, thank you so much. Before jumping to Tiffany, I just want to highlight a few themes that popped out. First of all, the word that sort of is in my mind right now is intentionality. Very clear, Edgar, that the way that you're doing this work with your high-tech colleagues is you're very thoughtful about each and every way how to be purposeful. Love the description of use of data for multiple purposes, but ultimately for learning in order to create impact. And the point that you made about relationships is so important, because the ability to be able to take what you're learning, the change packages you're creating, and help others to see that as an opportunity, it's built upon them having enough trust for you that they believe the intervention is one they should run with. As educators, they already know obviously a lot about their craft. So I just really appreciate the concrete examples that you gave. I think that'll make a big difference for folks who are listening. On to Tiffany. Tiffany, would love to hear a bit about Denver's work in relation to these 4 findings.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to share what we've been up to at Denver Public Schools. So for the first one around continuous improvement, for Denver Public Schools, we wanted to create a college ready on track NSI that was participant driven and user centered. And to do this, we focused our year 1 efforts with our 10 cohort 1 high schools on creating buy-in, establishing our why, and building capacity with improvement science and design thinking methodology. We chose to spend the majority of our year 1 on understanding the problem and creating our theory of improvement, which was done by collecting and analyzing empathy data and conducting a root cause analysis with causal mapping. By deeply focusing on understanding the problem and creating a theory of improvement as a network, it has built understanding and value for user-centered design and theories of improvement, and has led multiple schools within our cohort 1 to use and to create this methodology to create their own theory of improvements for other challenges within their school communities. It's also increased additional empathy building with our students and families to have a better understanding of their users. By having our cohort 1s drive the work, it uncovered additional needs around equity and anti-racist mindsets to understand the experiences of our Black and Latinx students, to be able to design for and with them, as well as grow and work as a network. This has been a priority for us in years 2 and a huge drive. For the second point around developing strong routines and norms for cross-team collaboration, we anchor in our network norms, but we also anchor in our district culturally responsive mindsets and community commitments. The hub team was also really intentional with school groupings and activities within our convenings by placing schools who hadn't worked together in the past and were different from one another to really create that network environment. This was done by sharing the why of their participation in the cohort 1, but also creating activities like data exploration activities, where instead of showing data school by school, we aggregated it at a network level and only showed that network data. This started to begin the mindset shift from my school, me, to our network, us, and was beneficial for helping us create the network vibe we were striving for in our district. This year, we are seeing the power of the network come out through the implementation of change ideas, as we have continued to intentionally group schools based on their change idea partner school at convenings, but we're also hearing from our school leaders that they are reaching out and learning from each other outside of our NSI activities. And in fact, even last week, we had a school leader reach out to us and tell us he had collaborated with 2 other school leaders that if it wasn't for the NSI, he would have not have reached out for, and that they had a really thoughtful, good conversation around grading for equity. The other component we've been really intentional about as a hub team is how do we bring central office teams into the different stages to help us create tighter alignment between our work and other district initiatives like our Black Excellence plans, as well as being thought partners for cohort 1 schools during convenings and design team meetings. This has helped to slowly spread continuous improvement knowledge and buy-in throughout central office support teams, and to begin shifting the mindset around what collaboration between central office and schools looks like and feels like. The third point on there around testing change ideas is one of our focus areas for this year. As the COVID-19 pandemic altered our start for implementing and creating change ideas, which we had planned to begin in April, but that happened. So we took a pause for a little bit, and we actually started creating the change ideas in July and have moved into implementation of our first PDSA cycle this fall. And so we are definitely, although everyone I can assume is pretty exhausted by the pandemic, we're also really energized and excited by the work that's taking place even during these current conditions.
Thank you, Tiffany, for that. And one of the things we haven't underscored enough is that each of the NSI leaders are working in very different contexts as far as the mix of LEAs. So Tiffany is obviously a district team member, and the district is the actual intermediary. You know, Jackie, with the nonprofit work of Network for College Success, is working within one district, but they're a nonprofit from the outside. Edgar and High Tech High is working across multiple different LEAs in California. It's just so important, Tiffany, the way you highlighted the opportunity to be able to kind of change mindset from within. And, you know, folks didn't hear, but your goal over time is that every high school in Denver will participate. So there's an opportunity for the whole high school system to be able to benefit from the learning that's happening in a handful of schools that will grow over time. I also really appreciate that the mindset point that you made, which was underscored so eloquently by Edgar as well. And love your quote about mindset me, our network us. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is about, is being able to see how you can be more powerful at your school level by bringing in learnings and being connected with others across schools. Thank you so much for that, Tiffany. Jackie, I'm going to circle back to you real quick. And as other folks know, would love for you to chime in briefly if you have thoughts to add on top of what Jackie will start with. So Jackie, as COVID has revealed deep and persistent inequities across the education landscape, how is NCS specifically working with school leaders and improvement team leads to advance equity? What are some of the things you're doing and or data you're tracking in this moment to mark progress?
Thanks, Josh. We have been fortunate in that as an organization, we started deep equity work about 7 years ago. And we did that exclusively internally. Very few people knew what we were up to. Because we learned very early on is that equity was not something we could go to a professional development session on and then go do equity to people. So that is important. I want to name that because when I have to hold up a mirror as example and look at how I am perpetuating white supremacy culture or maintaining the status quo, and I have to be okay with my colleagues, staff calling me out when I do that, and saying, hey, our own policies in this organization are inequitable. What are we going to do to change it? Or we're inequitably distributing resources, right? When we do that work for ourselves and we're metacognitive about it, then we're better equipped to build schema for other folks, to agitate, to disrupt, and to facilitate transformation for others. And so that's why I really wanted to mention that, because this is not a technical way of working to change mindsets around race and equity. But I think if I share with you, you asked about the measures, some of the things we're measuring, that will help clarify some of the specific things we're doing. So we are counting how many of our high school principals have developed an equity stance. And we don't mean just the technical aspect of writing something aspirational about a better world on paper. That requires deep identity work, identifying the principal's non-negotiables, operationalizing that, and letting us push you and see, are you really living what you're saying? So we count how many people develop their equity stance and operationalize it. We count how many principals have identified an inequitable policy or practice in their school and have changed it. So if the grading policy is inequitable, did you change it? What happened? If you're excluding students from higher rigorous, academically rigorous courses, how did you change the policy? What happened? So we've pushed past a point where we're just using the language, because sometimes it's sexy to use the language of equity. I'm afraid to say, as a Black woman, I'm terrified that this is now becoming a trend, right? And so we're pushing our organization and those we work with to act and show up differently. We're counting how many of our counselors honor the genius of our Black, Indigenous, and young people of color by elevating their student voice and actually using it to set policy or make decisions. We're counting how many conditions for student learning from PERTs. We're excited about PERTs we're seeing in the classrooms. We're counting how many teachers can name a belief and give us evidence of how their thinking has transformed. And then in our own office, we're counting how many times our teams are interrupting their own schema that perpetuates status quo, or they're at least beginning to question, what are we doing to perpetuate status quo? So those are some examples and some measures there.
Thank you, Jackie. Edgar or Tiffany, do you want to hop in with any thoughts?
I am just super encouraged by what you shared, Jackie, and very similar to us. Like, we have been on an equity journey for 2 years, not 7. So fingers crossed we'll continue that. But it definitely is a journey. But one thing we've really noticed is being intentional, but it needs to happen at all levels. This isn't just about cohort 1 participants changing their mindsets, but us as a hub team has also done additional PD, reading, diving into it, holding each other accountable, following up on microaggressions and thinking through it. But then also our leaders in our district are doing the same work. And so it's happening at all levels to really make an impactful change, and to also embrace some of these change ideas that are disrupting the system, to then have that. So I think it's just really key to be thinking about that around all the levels and who all needs to participate, whether you're in the cohort or you're outside of it.
The only thing that I will add is, one thing that we often stress with our teams is the importance of segmenting your list, whether it's with FAFSA, college applications, and putting names and faces to the work that you're doing. We need to know the lives and the backgrounds and who these students are, because sometimes we can set an equity aim, and we have all of our schools set equity aims, and we could have them talk about some of the work, what they want to do. But unless we actually know who are these students, who are the students that you're really let's give them a name. Let's give them, let's actually talk about them. And we bring that into our coaching calls. We say, can we look at your segmented list? Can we go in and see who are those students that you are working right now to increase those opportunities for? So really making it real for our schools.
That last point, Edgar, I appreciate the line I wrote down, doing equity to people, Jackie. That doesn't work. But the idea of there's many ways, obviously, to do it with people, but the idea of humanizing the students and their experiences are one way of getting at that in the right way. Appreciate that. Thank you for your comments. Edgar, going to you next. High Tech High runs several different networks, as you've discussed. Based on conversations we've had with several NSI leaders, there's a deep desire for meaningful connection to inform the work and promote learning. Tell us about how you promote cross-team learning across your networks, and which topics leaders and educators with whom you work are most interested in learning about with their peers?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question, Josh. This one is probably the one that is the most fun for all of us. And I'll tie it to, I think Jackie and Tiffany, both of you mentioned this about, really uncovering the whys and the purpose of doing this work and tying it back to this work. We have with some of our lightning rods or some of our district leaders been doing podcasts and interviewing them and just getting their stories as to why they're doing this, so they can also hear from themselves and share that with our network as to why this work is so important. But also, I think, Jackie, you mentioned just elevating the voices of students and parents. We have been trying at all of our convenings to include students in our events, so they can be side by side with us, helping us to understand what these challenges are. What are some possible solutions? We as adults come up with a lot of great ideas, but sometimes students come up with even better ideas or challenge our ideas as well. So elevating those voices, and also just the unique background stories. There's one convening that stands out so vividly, and this is when we were still doing face-to-face convenings, but we were, we had 4 individuals share their stories, and they were so powerful because it just spoke to, just not just college access work, but just why they're in the space that they're in, and why they're in the career space that they're in right now. So along with that, we also do a lot of bright spotting. We try to amplify those things that are working well. We sometimes do it at our convenings. We do it through our newsletters. We do it through our coaching calls. Sometimes when we're on a coaching calls, and we do coaching calls in buddy systems, but we will ask, if we hear, oh, a great resource that one of our lightning rods just shared, we'll say, oh, can we actually have access to that? Can we share that? Can you email us that document or send us that link? Because we oftentimes we hear of these great things, and we want to, of course, honor the fact that you are doing great work, and can we actually use that, because others might find that very useful as well. So a lot of bright spotting, and then just a lot of opportunities for our teams to share that learning across our networks. So we do, in our convenings and other events, we do triads of trust. So a lot of just small group settings. We do unpacking life maps through what I love doing the most, which is walk and talks, which I probably don't get to do as often in this pandemic era. And then also just focusing on our work. So we do a lot of dilemma consultancies and practice mingles, and using other protocols to just focus in on the work that we do. The last convening that we had, I sat in on a consultancy that principals from our network schools were talking about how to better authentically engage and communicate and have relationships with students, which I think is what a lot of schools are struggling with right now. And they talked about all these social media platforms that they've been trying out, and how things just haven't been sticking. And we landed on, and the group actually landed, because this is what the group consensus came to in this dilemma consultancy, was, do you really, like, what is the information you really want to know about your students and families? Like, what do you currently not know about your family? And so that gave him a roadmap to start thinking about, okay, how do we find that information out? And so having these opportunities to have peers like peers also engage in the work together.
Thanks, Edgar. Tiffany or Jackie, you want to jump in and offer any additional thoughts?
I was giggling because both Edgar and Tiffany, while you were talking, I'm over here sneaking and I'm jotting down all these notes. And so, Edgar, you so beautifully articulated the importance of cross-team learning, but I just want to take a quick moment and talk about how important the cross-NSI network has been for us. So just like you're facilitating that for your improvement communities, we have learned so much from High Tech High and PERTS and CORE and RISE and San Francisco Coalition of Schools. And right, it's been equally as important for us.
Absolutely. I ditto. Absolutely. I think that's one of the huge benefits of just being on these different, group calls that we have, or just being able to just have, we have like some monthly and weekly check-ins with some other NSIs. It's amazing. You're right. Absolutely.
I want to make sure, because we're running a little bit short on time, there's several questions I want to ask. And Tiffany, I want you to start on this, if I can ask you. So this change in landscape because of COVID has laid bare system inequities that have long been present for Black, Latino, and students experiencing poverty, and raise some new ideas and possibilities that weren't being considered before. With Denver as the perspective first, what opportunities do you see to reimagine education? I'd also love Edgar, Jackie, and certainly Liz to chime in on this as well.
So I think, like, although this is a really challenging time for a multitude of reasons, it also, like, we have talked a lot about, like, in our ideal state, non-COVID state, these are things we can't wait to do. But we also know there's leverage of, like, as we transition from change ideas in a remote environment in a pandemic to outside, how do we leverage that change? Because the world will not be the same when we exit this. And so how do we really leverage that to move faster and make bigger changes and more impactful during that transition phase? And what does that look like to prep in advance? And so one thing we've been focused a lot on is around active listening during this time, and to use that active listening to build trust and to make sure that we're really connecting with our school staff, with our families, our students, our communities, because everyone is having very different experiences throughout this pandemic. And how do we learn from that? How do we document it? And then how do we grow and improve through this so that we don't maintain this current status quo that we were living in, that I think a lot of people would agree is not working for us. It's not working for Denver Public Schools. And so we want to make that positive change and move forward. One key thing that has really come out that I'm, like, excited about from our NSI is around one of our school communities. Like, as we stopped and took reflection on our driver diagram in June and July, and we really looked at, like, does this driver diagram fit us for being in a pandemic, doing remote learning, having social unrest in our community? Like, is this still the right work to be doing, or do we need to make adjustments? And so one of the key things we realized is we need more Black and Latinx student and family voices in this driver diagram, because we can't safely say that. And so because of that, it really created this opportunity for us to create a brave space for us to talk about our NSI, about anti-racism, about dismantling systems of oppression with our work, and creating those conversations that brought out vulnerability, humility, and fostered trust among us to move this work forward. Those conversations then moved to our school level context, where one of our schools that I just have to shout out, West Early College High School, they took that and were like, we need to know more about our family and community. Like, I don't know if we're creating the right change ideas. And because of that, we need to start with a change idea centered around family engagement, learn from it. And from that data that they collected, have now created 3 change ideas that are really centered around things that their students and parents are excited about, and now have students and parents participating in their design teams and feel like they have ownership over this work as we move through it. And so it's been really exciting to take that step back in COVID and really think about people, and then use that to make informed change that hopefully has lasting impact for us.
Thank you for that, Tiffany. Edgar, Jackie, or Liz, do you guys want to build off of that?
One thing we often share with our network about this outreach and trying to get a better sense of their school communities is, focusing on the message, the messenger, and the media or the mode. How do you better get others involved in really doing this work? Like, what are some other actors in your ecosystem that can probably help you along the way? A lot of our schools have relied on their staff members and individuals within their school settings, but also just the importance of the community, really leveraging community resources, faith organizations, leveraging other social services that are within their community, because oftentimes, the real needs are not necessarily, some of the direct services that our schools are providing, but really those other types of supports that will get them to be able to focus on the work that they're trying to achieve. So having others help in messaging that to their communities.
Thank you, Edgar. Jackie or Liz?
I can pick up on something Tiffany said, which is that we've been studying across the country is the way families are innovating to meet the moment. Families as their first teachers of their children are looking at every day and the days ahead and thinking about, how can I ensure that my child is learning? And I mean that across all dimensions. And so we've been studying family innovations and trying to imagine what a family-centered education system looks like when you start with the family and build outward, as opposed to starting at the system level and building down to the family, and keeping family engagement a siloed set of things. And there are so many promising practices out there, and very wrapped up in that are so many schools, district systems, CBOs that are breaking down silos that are very, very troublesome and lead to resource hoarding and all types of inequities to really share across boundaries. And I would say that's one way in which the virtual platform is actually offering opportunity. People are building relationships and sharing teachers, sharing class spaces, sharing other types of resources in ways that they haven't before, and collaborating in really, really deep and meaningful ways.
Thank you, Liz. Jackie, anything else you want to share?
No, you can go ahead.
Great. Well, I want to just highlight a very clear strand across all the comments that were made. There's a different relationship that we have with our community members than I think we've ever thought about before. Student ownership, agency, really driving the work, not just offering input, but being part of the work, because our students know what they need. And talking about, as you said, Liz, families sort of as the first teachers, we have an opportunity to rethink parent engagement, guardian engagement, and community engagement because of the moment that we're in. Those are all great opportunities to sustain this work as well, because at the end of the day, even as intermediaries, except for the district, obviously, as the intermediary, we're of support for organizations that will be there for the long term. And the more that we're investing in them as well as the community in general, the better chance there is that this will be something that will be a long-term change on behalf of young people. Truly, as a former high school teacher and principal, and as a district leader, this has been the highlight of not just my day, but my week and my month. You can imagine right now, as we cannot travel, as Edgar, you said, you can't be in the work with people truly. You need to find moments of COVID microjoy, as I say. And this comes from being in the work with people who are doing things in different places, from California to Chicago to Denver to New York, and obviously nationally, Liz. Just thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your work. The hour went by super fast. So obviously very, very thankful for you and for our audience members who've been submitting great questions. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at GatesUS and check out our website at k12education.gatesfoundation.org. We will share answers to all the questions, we promise, shortly after the Thanksgiving holiday. We see this learning as an ongoing conversation, and we hope to continue to share what we're seeing in this work with you regularly. We are grateful for your partnership and our shared commitment to improving outcomes for Black, Latino, and students experiencing poverty. Research continues to highlight what educators are telling us every day, just how concerning this pandemic is for these students. And we are grateful to everyone who's working day in and day out to address their growing needs. I wish you, our panelists, our audience members, a very happy Thanksgiving. We look forward to staying in touch. Thanks so much for being with us today. Take good care.